I wasn't supposed to hear what my children said that night. I had stepped out of the dining room for just a minute to answer a phone call from one of our store managers. When I came back, I didn't walk in right away. I paused in the hallway. And that's when I heard my daughter whisper to my son, "The jewelry stores alone will be worth millions once the estate transfers." For a moment, I honestly thought I misunderstood. Estate transfers? My son lowered his voice and said, almost casually, "Especially the flagship location. That place could fund retirement by itself." Retirement. They were talking about retirement money. My retirement money. And the strange part? I was sitting at that same dinner table just 10 minutes earlier. Still running the company. Still signing every payroll check. Still waking up at 6 every morning to open the main store. Yet somehow, in their conversation, I was already gone. I stood in the hallway holding the edge of the wall like I needed it to stay upright. Because in that moment something very quiet, and very painful, settled in my chest. My children weren't talking about helping run the business one day. They were discussing how to divide it. And that was the first time I realized. They weren't waiting for the future. They were waiting for my estate.
Welcome to Life Voices, where family drama turns into late-life justice. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
For 40 years, I believed my children understood what that business meant. Not the numbers, not the accounts, not even the properties, I mean the life behind it. My husband and I opened our first jewelry store when we were barely 30. It was a tiny place on a quiet street just outside downtown. The sign above the door was hand-painted because we couldn't afford a proper one. Inside there was one glass display case, 3 trays of rings, and a second-hand desk that wobbled every time someone leaned on it. That was our empire in the beginning. I remember the first day we opened. My husband stood behind the counter polishing the same bracelet for nearly an hour because no one walked through the door. Around noon he finally laughed and said, "Well, at least the lights work." We worked every single day. Sundays included. Sometimes we stayed open 12 hours. Sometimes 14. I learned how to repair clasps, replace stones, and clean watches. My husband handled suppliers and inventory. At night we balanced the books at the kitchen table while eating leftovers. There were months we weren't sure we could keep the lights on. But slowly, people began to trust us. A young couple bought an engagement ring. Then they came back years later for anniversary bands. Then they brought their daughter when she got engaged. That's how a family business grows. Not from money, from time, from reputation, from thousands of quiet conversations across a counter. By the time our son and daughter were teenagers, the store was busy enough that they sometimes helped after school. My son used to sit on a tall stool near the register doing homework while greeting customers. My daughter loved arranging necklaces in the display cases. Back then, I believed they saw the business the same way we did. As something living, something fragile, something worth protecting. When my husband passed away 8 years ago, the company already had 5 locations. 2 downtown, 1 in the suburbs, 2 inside shopping centers. People often told me I should sell everything and retire. But I never even considered it. Because to me those stores were not just properties. They were 40 years of our lives. 40 years of early mornings, late nights, and promises kept. After my husband died, I took over everything. Suppliers, payroll, store management, leases, every decision, every contract, every check, and my children never once complained. At least not out loud. They would come to family dinners and ask polite questions. "How are the stores doing, Mom? Busy season this year? Still working too much?" I thought those were normal conversations. The kind of things grown children ask when they care. But now, after hearing them whisper at the dinner table, those same questions sounded different in my memory. Not curious, not supportive, calculating, because once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it. Little things began to feel strange. Small comments I had ignored before suddenly started making sense. "Mom, maybe you should slow down. Mom, you've worked hard enough. Mom, maybe it's time to simplify things." Simplify. That word started appearing more and more often. Simplify the company. Simplify the estate. Simplify the future. But the future they were simplifying was mine. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that those conversations had probably been happening for a long time. just not in front of me. At family dinners they always spoke kindly. My daughter would pour the wine and smile. My son would ask about sales numbers during the holidays. Busy season this year, Mom? I would nod and say something simple like, Christmas is always good for jewelry. But now I remembered the way they sometimes exchanged quick glances. The way conversations about the stores suddenly changed direction when I entered the room. At the time I told myself it was nothing. Children grow up, families change, but that night in the hallway, listening to them discuss my life's work like it was a future payout, something inside me shifted, not anger, not even betrayal, just clarity, because for the first time in 40 years of running that business, I realized I might be the only person left who still saw it as a story. To them, it had already become an inheritance. About a week after that dinner, I met with our family attorney. His name is Daniel Harper. He had worked with my husband and me for nearly 20 years, handling everything from leases to corporate paperwork. Daniel had seen the company grow from one small store into a regional chain. He knew our story almost as well as we did. That morning I arrived at his office early. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that always comes with expensive carpet and polished wood walls. Daniel greeted me warmly, just like he always had. "Good to see you, Margaret," he said, shaking my hand. "You too, Daniel." We sat down in his conference room with coffee between us and a folder of documents on the table. At first, the meeting was completely ordinary. We reviewed lease renewals, insurance policies, inventory coverage, normal business matters. Then, toward the end of the meeting, Daniel asked a question that made me pause. "Margaret, has anyone discussed restructuring the company ownership with you recently?" I looked at him, confused. "No," I said. "Why would they?" Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Not alarmed, not dramatic, just thoughtful. "Well, it's probably nothing," he said slowly. "But over the past few months I've received a few inquiries." "Inquiries?" I asked. "Yes." "From who?" He hesitated for a moment. "From your children." For a second I honestly thought I had misheard him. "My children?" I repeated. Daniel nodded calmly. "They asked some general questions about how the company would transfer in the future." "Transfer?" I asked. "Yes. Ownership transfer, asset division, estate structuring." Each word landed heavier than the one before. Daniel opened the folder in front of him and slid a piece of paper toward me. "These were hypothetical questions," he said carefully. "Nothing formal, but they asked about several scenarios." I looked down at the page. There were notes, short lines written in Daniel's neat handwriting. Sell downtown location, liquidate inventory value, divide real estate assets. I felt something cold move through my chest. "Did they say why they were asking?" I said quietly. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "They mentioned wanting to understand the long-term future of the business." The long-term future. That phrase sounded strangely familiar. Just like the whispers I heard at dinner. Just like the conversations about retirement money. Suddenly all the pieces began fitting together. My son's casual comments about slowing down. My daughter's suggestions about simplifying the company. Their sudden interest in property values. It wasn't curiosity. It was preparation. They weren't asking how to run the business. They were asking how to divide it. Daniel watched my expression carefully. "Margaret," he said gently, "I assumed you were aware of these conversations." "I wasn't," I answered. The room became very quiet. For a moment I stared at the papers on the table. 40 years of work, 5 stores, hundreds of customers, employees who had been with us for decades. And somewhere, outside that room, my children were discussing which pieces might sell fastest. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "If you'd like," he said, "we can review your current estate structure." I looked up at him. "Is there something wrong with it?" "No," he said quickly. "Everything is perfectly legal and valid." He paused. "But it does leave full future ownership decisions to your heirs." My heirs. The word sounded colder than I expected. I sat there for a long moment thinking about my husband. About the tiny store with the wobbling desk. About the nights we spent balancing receipts at the kitchen table. And suddenly I understood something very clearly. My children were already planning a future where I was no longer part of the decision. Daniel waited patiently. Finally I said something very simple. "Daniel, yes? I think it's time we reviewed everything." Daniel didn't rush me. He simply nodded and pulled another folder from his desk. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, the original structure of the company my husband and I created together. Back then everything had seemed simple. 2 owners, 1 vision, 1 future. If one of us passed away, the other continued running the business. And when the time eventually came, the company would transfer to our children equally. That had always been the assumption. Not because we planned it carefully, but because that's what families usually do. Daniel placed the documents neatly in front of me. "We can update anything you want," he said calmly. "Ownership structures, voting rights, trust protections, succession planning." Succession planning, another phrase that sounded harmless, until you realized what it meant. It meant deciding who would control everything after you were gone. And for the first time in my life, I realized something important. Just because someone is your child doesn't always mean they're ready to carry what you built. I slowly closed the folder. "Daniel," I said quietly. "Yes?" This business wasn't built to be divided. He studied my face for a moment. Then he nodded. "I understand." When I left Daniel's office that day, I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. For years I had been moving through my life the same way I always had. Wake up early, visit the stores, review the numbers, speak with managers, check inventory reports. The business had its rhythm, and I trusted that rhythm. I also trusted my family. But something had shifted, not loudly, quietly, the kind of quiet change that happens when you finally see something clearly for the first time. That afternoon I drove to our flagship store downtown. It's the largest location we have. 3 floors, large glass windows, the same building my husband and I bought 23 years ago when we thought expanding to the city center was the biggest risk we had ever taken. I still remember signing the papers for that building. My husband squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Well, we're either very brave or very foolish." It turned out we were just stubborn. The store was busy when I walked in. A young couple was looking at engagement rings. 2 women were comparing bracelets near the back counter. One of our longtime employees, Sandra, stood behind the register helping a customer. Sandra has worked with us for 18 years. She started as a sales associate and now manages most of the daily operations. When she saw me, she smiled the way she always does. "Good afternoon, Margaret." "Hello, Sandra. Everything okay?" "Yes," I said, "just visiting." But that wasn't entirely true. I wasn't visiting. I was looking, really looking, at the counters, at the lighting, at the display cases my husband personally installed when we renovated the store years ago. I walked slowly past the engagement ring section. The same section where hundreds of couples had stood over the years, choosing something that would become part of their story. A young man was nervously asking the sales associate about diamond sizes. His girlfriend was pretending not to listen. I smiled to myself. That moment never changes. Then I walked toward the back office. On the wall there's a framed photograph. It shows the first store we ever opened. The tiny shop, the crooked sign, the single glass case, my husband standing in front of the door with his sleeves rolled up and a ridiculous grin on his face. Sandra followed me into the office. She looked at the photo and laughed softly. "I always loved that picture," she said. "He looks so proud." "He was," I said. We stood there quietly for a moment. Then Sandra asked something simple. "Did you ever imagine it would grow this big?" I shook my head slowly. "No." Then I looked back at the photograph. "But we never built it to become big." Sandra tilted her head slightly. "Then why did you build it?" I didn't answer right away. Because the truth is, my husband and I never built the company for growth charts or market value. We built it because we loved the work. We loved helping people mark the important moments in their lives. Engagements, anniversaries, births, graduations. Jewelry stores aren't really about jewelry. They're about memory. And standing there in that office, looking at 40 years of work hanging on the wall, I realized something that made my decision very easy. This business deserved a future. Just not the one my children were planning. So that evening, I called Daniel, and I told him we needed to start making changes. So that evening, I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Daniel Harper. It's Margaret." "Hello, Margaret. Everything all right?" I looked around my office for a moment before answering. The same office I had used for years. The same desk where my husband once sat balancing invoices late at night. Yes, I said finally. Everything is very clear now. Daniel paused, the way lawyers do when they understand that a conversation is about to become important. What would you like to review? He asked. Everything, I said. Ownership structure, voting rights, future control of the company. What happens if I retire? What happens if I don't? And most importantly, what happens after I'm gone? Daniel didn't interrupt. He simply listened. Then he said something very calm. Those things can absolutely be adjusted. I know, I replied. But I want to be sure something is very clear in the documents. What is that? He asked. I looked again at the photograph of our first store on the wall. The crooked sign, the single glass display, my husband smiling like he had just discovered the secret of the universe. This company, I said slowly, was built to survive people's impatience. Daniel was quiet for a second. Then he said, I think I understand what you mean. I sat down at my desk and opened a notebook. For the first time in many years, I began writing ideas about the future of the company. Not the future my children expected. A different one where the stores stayed together. One where the employees who had spent decades helping build the business were protected. One where the company couldn't simply be divided and sold piece by piece like furniture at an estate sale. When I finished explaining my thoughts, Daniel spoke again. There is a way to do that, he said. A trust. I closed the notebook. Good, I said. Then that's exactly what we're going to build. The next morning I arrived at Daniel's office earlier than usual. The city was still quiet. Offices were just beginning to open, and the lobby of the building smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished floors. I had slept surprisingly well the night before. Not because the situation was easy, but because my mind had finally stopped pretending. When Daniel greeted me, he already had several folders prepared on the conference table. Good morning, Margaret, he said. Good morning, Daniel. We sat down, and he opened the first folder. This, he said, sliding the papers toward me, is the current structure of the company as it exists today. I already knew what it said. My husband and I had created a very simple structure when we expanded the second store years ago. After he passed away, his ownership transferred entirely to me, which meant something very straightforward. I owned everything, every store, every lease, every asset, every piece of inventory. Daniel tapped the document gently. And under the current estate structure, he continued, upon your passing, ownership transfers equally to your 2 children. I nodded. That's what we originally intended. Daniel leaned back slightly. Yes, he said, but that structure assumes something important. What's that? I asked. That the heirs share the same vision for the company. I almost smiled at that. Vision. Such a polite word. Daniel, I said calmly, I'm not sure they share any vision at all. He didn't disagree. Instead, he opened another folder. This is the structure we discussed yesterday. I looked down at the papers. A trust. But not a simple one. Daniel had outlined a full corporate trust structure designed to protect the business from exactly the kind of situation we were facing. The jewelry company itself would move into the trust, not as property to be divided, but as a single protected entity. Control would be governed by specific rules, voting rights, management requirements, restrictions on selling assets, restrictions on liquidating stores. Anyone who wanted to run the company would need to actually work inside the company, not just inherit it. I read through the first several pages carefully. This prevents them from selling the stores? I asked. Yes, Daniel said, unless the trust board unanimously approves it. Board? I asked. Yes. Daniel pointed to another section. You would appoint the initial board members. I looked at the page. The board would oversee the company long after I was gone, ensuring the business stayed intact, ensuring it stayed operational, ensuring no one could simply sell the downtown property and retire on the profits. I turned another page. Employees with more than 10 years of service would receive profit-sharing protections. Long-term managers would have voting input. Store closures would require board review. Daniel watched me quietly while I read. Finally he asked, "What do you think?" I closed the folder slowly. It protects the company, I said. Yes, and it prevents impatience. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. That's one way to put it. For a moment I sat there thinking about my children, about the conversation I overheard, About the notes Daniel showed me from their questions. Selling stores, dividing assets, planning retirement. They were imagining a future built on liquidation. But this structure would make that impossible. The company would remain exactly what it had always been. A working business, not a collection of properties waiting to be sold. Daniel leaned forward slightly. There is one thing you should understand. What's that? I asked. This structure doesn't prevent your children from being involved. I nodded. I know. They can still work in the company. Yes. They can even run the company, if they choose to. But? I asked. But they would have to earn that role. I looked back down at the trust papers. 40 years of work, hundreds of employees, thousands of customers, generations of families who trusted our stores. No, this was never meant to become a retirement payout. I picked up Daniel's pen. Let's move forward, I said. And that was the moment the future of my company changed forever. Daniel scheduled the signing 2 days later. He told me it would take some time to prepare the final structure. Trust documents are not small things. They contain pages of legal language designed to protect every detail of what you build. But when Friday morning arrived, everything was ready. I walked into his office carrying the same leather folder I've used for business papers for almost 20 years. Daniel stood when I entered. Good morning, Margaret. Good morning. The conference table was already prepared. Several thick documents were stacked neatly in front of my chair. Each page had small tabs marking where signatures were required. I sat down and looked at the stack. 40 years of work, reduced to paper. Daniel noticed the way I looked at it. It always feels strange, he said gently. What does? Putting a lifetime into documents. I nodded slowly. Yes, it does. He opened the first folder. This establishes the Harper Jewelry Trust, he explained. The company, all store properties, inventory, trademarks, and operational assets will transfer into the trust structure immediately upon signing. I turned the first few pages. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. The company would no longer exist as something that could be divided in an estate. It would exist as something that continued, something protected. Daniel continued explaining the details. The trust board will initially consist of 3 members. He pointed to the names. Daniel himself, Sandra, my store manager of 18 years, and me. Sandra had no idea yet. I planned to tell her personally later. She deserves that responsibility, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. She understands the business. She helped build it, I replied. Then he turned another page. Your children will remain beneficiaries of the trust. I raised an eyebrow. Meaning? They will receive financial distributions from company profits. But they cannot sell the company. No. They cannot liquidate properties. No. And they cannot take control of the company unless they actively work in it and receive board approval. That's correct. I leaned back in my chair for a moment. It was a strange feeling. Not revenge, not punishment, just balance. Because the truth is, my children weren't bad people. They were simply thinking about the business like an inheritance, instead of a responsibility. Daniel slid the signature page toward me. If everything looks correct, he said, we can finalize it today. I read the final page slowly. Then I picked up the pen. For a moment I hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but because I remembered the tiny shop with the crooked sign, the single glass display case, my husband laughing behind the counter. I smiled slightly to myself. Then I signed my name. Once, then again, and again, page after page. When I finished, Daniel carefully gathered the documents and placed them back into the folder. That's it, he said. It's done. I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, sadness, something. But instead, what I felt was very simple. Peace. Because the future of the company was no longer uncertain. It was protected, not by anger, not by arguments, but by structure. Daniel stood and shook my hand. You made a wise decision, he said. Maybe, I replied. Then I added something quietly. Or maybe I just finally stopped pretending everything was fine. That afternoon I went back to the downtown store. Sandra was reviewing invoices at the front counter when I walked in. She looked up and smiled. Back again today? Yes, I said. There's something I need to talk to you about. She followed me into the office. I closed the door behind us. And for the first time in many years, I told someone exactly what the future of the company would look like. Sandra closed the office door behind her and sat across from me. She looked curious, but not worried. "What's going on?" she asked. I folded my hands on the desk for a moment before answering. "You've worked here a long time," I said. She laughed softly. 18 years last month. I remember the day you started," I replied. "You were nervous about selling your first watch." She smiled at the memory. I thought I would drop it. "You almost did," I said, smiling back. For a second the room felt light again. Then I slid a copy of the trust summary across the desk. Sandra looked down at the papers. "What is this?" "It's the future of the company," I said calmly. She began reading. At first her expression was simply focused. Then it slowly changed. Confusion. Surprise. Finally she looked up at me. "You're putting the company into a trust?" "Yes." "And I'm on the board?" "Yes." Sandra blinked twice like she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Margaret, this is a lot." I nodded. "I know." She looked back at the document again. "Why me?" That question was easy. "Because you stayed," I said. "When the second store struggled, you stayed. When my husband passed away, you stayed. When everyone said I should sell the business and retire." I paused and looked around the office. "You stayed." Sandra didn't say anything for a moment. Then she folded the document carefully and placed it back on the desk. "Then I guess," she said quietly, "we're going to keep building it." Something interesting happened after the trust was signed. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. No family argument. Just silence. For several weeks, life continued exactly as it always had. I visited the stores, reviewed reports, spoke with managers, met suppliers. From the outside, nothing looked different. But inside the company, everything had quietly changed. The ownership had transferred into the trust. The board structure was active. Legal protections were in place. The company now had a future that could not be rushed. And strangely enough, that changed the atmosphere almost immediately. The pressure disappeared. Those subtle conversations about slowing down suddenly stopped. The word simplify vanished from family dinners. My son stopped asking about the value of the downtown property. My daughter stopped mentioning retirement plans tied to the company. In fact, something else happened. They became very polite, almost careful. My son began calling more often. "Just checking in, Mom." My daughter suddenly wanted to have lunch together. "Maybe we should spend more time together." I noticed the shift immediately. People behave differently when assumptions disappear. Not worse, not better, just differently. One Sunday afternoon we were all having dinner at my daughter's house. The same dining room where I had overheard that conversation weeks earlier. The same table, the same chairs, but the energy in the room felt different. My son asked politely, "How are the stores doing lately?" "Busy," I said. My daughter nodded. "That's good." Then she added something that made me look up. "You work so hard, Mom." I smiled. I always have. No one mentioned selling anything. No one mentioned retirement. No one mentioned estate planning. The subject had quietly disappeared. After dinner my son helped clear the plates. As we stood at the kitchen counter, he hesitated for a moment. Then he asked carefully, "Mom, have you thought about the long-term future of the company?" I rinsed a plate in the sink and answered calmly, "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That's good." He didn't ask another question. And that was when I realized something important. They knew, not the details, but they understood something had changed. Word travels quickly in legal and financial circles. Daniel had probably spoken with their advisors when the trust was filed. They knew the company structure was no longer what they assumed. And suddenly, their expectations had adjusted. But the biggest change wasn't in them. It was in me. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Not defensive, not worried about the future. Not quietly wondering what would happen to everything we built. The company no longer depended on family expectations. It depended on structure, on people who actually worked inside it, on time. And time is something I understand very well. Because businesses like ours aren't built quickly. They grow slowly, like trust, like reputation, like memory. A few days later I stood again in the downtown store. The young man who had been looking at engagement rings earlier that week came back. This time with his girlfriend. They stood at the counter smiling nervously while Sandra showed them several rings. Finally the young man looked at me and asked, "Do you think she'll like this one?" I looked at the ring he was holding. Simple, elegant, the kind of ring people keep forever. Yes, I said, I think she will. And as I watched them walk out of the store together, I felt something very simple. Pride, not because of money, not because of property, but because the business was still doing exactly what it was meant to do. Helping people start their stories. And now, I knew those stories would continue long after I was gone. Exactly the way my husband and I always hoped they would. I stood there for a moment longer after they left. Sandra was already helping another customer, explaining the difference between two bracelet clasps. The store lights reflected softly against the glass displays, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the room. It felt exactly the way it had felt for decades. Normal, alive. I walked slowly toward the front windows and looked out at the street. People were passing by with shopping bags, couples holding hands, a mother pulling a child along who clearly didn't want to leave the toy store next door. Life moving forward. That's the thing about businesses like ours. They are never really about ownership. They are about continuity. For 40 years my husband and I had opened those doors every morning. Not because we were thinking about the day we wouldn't be here, but because we believed the work itself mattered. And now, standing there, I finally understood something that had taken me a long time to learn. The greatest protection for something you build is making sure it doesn't depend on anyone's impatience, not even your own family's. Because businesses built slowly deserve the same kind of future. One that unfolds slowly too. Here's something I learned at 65. Money doesn't destroy families, it reveals them. Sometimes the people closest to you slowly stop seeing your life as a story you are still living. Instead, they begin to see it as something waiting to be inherited. An estate, a future payout, a collection of assets that will eventually belong to them. But a life's work is not an estate. It is time, it is sacrifice, it is thousands of small decisions that no one else had to make. And sometimes protecting what you build doesn't require anger. It simply requires clarity. I didn't argue with my children. I didn't accuse anyone. I just made sure the future of the business depended on people who understood the work. Not people who were waiting for the ending. So now I'm curious. Have you ever had a moment when you realized someone was already planning your future without you? Tell me where you're watching from. And tell me if you've ever had to protect something you spent your life building.
Your voice matters here. Share your story below. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Have you ever lived through something similar? Share in the comments. Your voice matters here.